Hello, and welcome to Spotify Next Wave Masterclass. My name is Mike Muni, and I lead podcast creator partnerships here at Spotify. If you're watching this, it means that you are a part of Spotify Next Wave, Spotify's first ever initiative to enable and support student podcasters. We're super excited about podcasting here at Spotify. We've seen crazy growth of podcast listening and consumption on the platform, so all of you couldn't have picked a better time to jump into the space. What we're going to do today is talk you all through some tips, tricks, features, and tools that Spotify offers to make sure that all of you are succeeding on platform, as well as talk to some top podcast creators who will also tell you some insider info on how all of you can succeed in podcasting. So I'm going to walk you all today through is called the Content Partnerships Handbook. Content Partnerships is the team that I sit on, and our job is to work with podcast creators like all of you to make sure that they have all of the tips and tricks that they need to know in order to succeed on Spotify. One of the main tools that we offer podcast creators, and as student podcast creators, I want to make sure that all of you know how to use, is something called Spotify for Podcasters. Spotify for Podcasters is our creator and analytics portal that all of you guys can have access to. I actually brought along a really helpful video that will tell you all the ways that you can utilize Spotify for Podcasters as a student podcast creator.
You already know how to tell a great story. Stories that draw listeners in, spark a debate, make people laugh, or maybe even freak them out. Whatever story you're telling, we're here to help your podcast grow. Welcome to Spotify for Podcasters. Submit your podcast to Spotify and share it with millions of listeners in over 75 countries, no matter how they're tuning in. Meet your listeners and followers, learn more about who they are, and even what music they like, so you can understand your audience and pitch to sponsors. See how people respond to your episodes, which ones they enjoy, where and how they listen, and when they tune in, or zone out, so you can make each episode better than the one before. Reach a world of new listeners, hold their attention, and watch your followers grow. And then you can focus on telling the great stories only you can tell. This is Spotify for Podcasters.
So as I mentioned, Spotify for Podcasters is our creator portal and analytics platform. You can use it to get your show on Spotify. You can use it to edit your show's presence on the platform. And you can also use it to get very robust audience information, stuff like starts, streams, episodic retention, your audience demo, anything that you need to know in order to grow and optimize your podcast on Spotify. Signing up for Spotify for Podcasters is super easy. All you need to do is go to podcasters.spotify.com to get started and just click the button that says Get Started. If you have a Spotify account, you just need to use your login to access the dashboard. And if not, you just need to click Sign Up in order to create a new account. Once you've signed in, you just need to click that ... button that you'll see on the top left of the screen, and then select either add or claim a podcast. If your show isn't on Spotify yet, you can actually use Spotify for Podcasters to submit the show and have it distributed onto the platform. Again, all you need to do is click that Get Started button and actually just drop in your RSS feed into the platform. It will search for it, and then you'll actually get an email verification code that will be sent to the email associated with the RSS feed. So you're going to want to make sure that you have access to that email when you submit the podcast through Spotify for Podcasters. If your podcast is already on Spotify, then you can do what we call claiming your dashboard. So then you just have to follow the same process where you paste your RSS feed into Spotify for Podcasters. And then after a brief email verification process, you'll have access to your show's dashboard within Spotify for Podcasters. So now that I've given you some info on S4P, I also want to make sure that you guys know about some of the platform tools that we offer podcast creators on the platform in order to help grow and optimize your show. So the first platform tool I want to call out for you guys is your show page. This is really important because it's essentially a home for your podcast on Spotify. People who go to your show page will be able to read your show's description, as well as browse and download episodes. Another thing that I want to call out that's really important about your show page is that it's where listeners can opt in to follow your show. There's a big button on everyone's show page in green that says follow. And you're going to want to make sure to promote this button to all of your listeners so that they know to opt in to follow your show. The reason why we recommend this to all of our podcast creators is because when someone follows your show on Spotify, it means that new episodes of your show will automatically populate in their library. So you definitely want to make sure to promote this to all the listeners of your show. Another thing we want to call out about your show page is it's also where listeners can hear the trailer for your podcast. So if you guys have a trailer for your podcast, what you can do is that you can select it through Spotify for Podcasters, and then it will automatically appear at the top of your show page. This way, anyone who finds your show on platform will easily be able to get a quick glimpse into what the show is all about. In addition to your show page, I also want to call out some of the promotional tools that we offer podcasters on Spotify. So what's really cool about Spotify is that we have really clean social platform integrations with all the major social media platforms. So you guys have probably seen our Instagram stories integration, where someone can promote a piece of content on Spotify, whether it be a podcast, a show or episode, or even an artist album or track. And then as a user on Instagram, you can click through that Instagram story and it will take you directly to that piece of content on Spotify. So we offer this integration on Instagram. We also offer it on Facebook, on Twitter, on Snapchat, even in iOS messages. The way you access this feature is you go to your show or episode on Spotify. You can click that 3 ... button, and then a drop-down menu will appear offering you all the options of where you want to share your podcast, whether it be the show or episode. This is really important and a really clean and easy way to promote your show to listeners. So definitely recommend that you guys utilize this feature. Want to also just call out again the follow button. I have it in here twice because it's so important. You're going to definitely want to encourage all of your fans to follow your podcast on Spotify. Not only will this mean that new episodes of your show will automatically appear in their library, but it will also inform some of our algorithmic recommendations on the platform. So again, you definitely want to make sure that you're recommending all of your fans and listeners to follow the show on Spotify. Definitely want to make sure that you all have some contacts and resources at your disposal. The first one I want to call out is the FAQ section of Spotify for Podcasters. This is a really robust resource and definitely should be your first stop for any and all S4P related questions. If you can't find what you're looking for in the FAQ section, then feel free to reach out to our technical support team. You can just email them at support@spotify.com. Some other resources that I want to call out. The first one would be our Twitter handle @4podcasters. You'll definitely want to follow this because it'll constantly push out product updates, tips and tricks, industry insights and trends that we're seeing on our end, all the kind of information that you'll need to know in order to optimize on Spotify. And then finally, also check out the blog at podcasters.spotify.com/blog. Not only will this give you some similar tips and tricks and industry insights, but we also highlight top creators and do some interviews so that you can continue to learn more about how you can succeed and optimize on Spotify. So now that I've walked through some best practices, I also wanted to give everyone the opportunity to hear from a top podcast creator firsthand, someone who's in the trenches every single day creating a top 100 podcast on Spotify. So I reached out to my buddies, Nick and Jack, the creators of Snacks Daily, some of my favorite podcast creators and also just good friends of mine, in order to have a conversation to hear what tips and tricks they would recommend from their experience for student podcasters who are just starting out. Nick and Jack of Snacks Daily, you might know them from not their one, but 2 daily podcasts they do on Spotify, Snacks Daily and Snacks Minute, that go out to hundreds of thousands of followers every single day. So welcome, Nick and Jack. How are you guys doing?
Great to be here, Mike. I wish we could be doing this in person, but really, really fun to get the whole group together.
This is the most interesting and fun Zoom of the week scheduled for me.
This is actually our best Zoom presentation yet, Jack. I think we can say that.
Nick and Jack are friends of ours here at Spotify. We work together super closely for years now. Actually, when we rolled out your daily drive product, we approached Nick and Jack and said, hey, We love the content that you're doing. Would you be interested in creating something shorter that we might be able to plug into your daily drive? And that product ended up being Snacks Minute, which has been a huge success on Spotify. Snacks Minute, Snacks Daily, both very regularly top 100, top 50 podcasts on Spotify. So I'm super excited to talk to you guys today. I think the best place to start would just to be you guys to talk to us about how you got started.
Well, Mike, first of all, fantastic to be here. You know how much fun we have getting to work with you and the whole Spotify team. So thank you for having us. But to answer your question about like how this podcast started, Jack and I have to like travel back to like when Facebook had just become a thing. We were about to go off to college in Vermont, and we found out we were going to be freshman year roommates. And fortunately, we continue to be best friends years and years later. But this begins basically in a freshman year dorm room where we realized we had the same interest in Seinfeld DVDs and the New York Yankees and actually the same protein shake.
It's so great that we're talking to college, student audience, Mike, because freshman year college roommates. I didn't get to pick my roommate. It was totally random. But flash forward 4 years and we'd graduated college. We were both working in the finance industry in New York City. And we decided to be roommates again. And that's where our kind of like relationship took it to the next level because we'd already been roommates. But that's when we became entrepreneurs together. So Nick and I were both working in finance, but we started side hustles. Basically, we craved an entrepreneurial endeavor. We craved an outlet for creativity beyond like the spreadsheets we were working on at our banks. So we started something called Market Snacks, which basically tried to make financial news digestible and entertaining. It started as a blog post that very night in November of 2011, Nick, when we decided at the bar to like try this thing out. We haven't missed a day covering the news since then. So we cover your top 3 financial stories of the day. We very much desire a curated, diverse set of stories. So if you have like a blue chip story on the one to open with, then we want a tech story in the middle and finish with like this crazy company that's building farms inside grocery stores to finish things off.
Basically, to give everyone a sense of what this looked like, we had like just graduated college. We were getting into the work world where we found out we had to shave every day, which was brutal. That was not what we were doing in college. It was intense. And we realized, Jack and I were doing spreadsheets every day. And when we launched this startup, Market Snacks, to make business news more accessible to all, Jack and I would literally, because we were doing this outside of our day jobs, we would literally be like working on this after doing all those spreadsheets on the subway on the way home every single day. And we haven't missed a day of covering the market since then, as Jack pointed out. But that journey has seen this startup evolve beyond the blog, beyond the newsletter, into Jack and I started doing TV and video appearances and becoming kind of the voice for millennials about business news, making business news quick, clear, and entertaining. At a certain point, we would like do a video appearance at the New York Stock Exchange, jump on the subway, then head up to work in the morning. And that's when we were kind of fortunate after a few years to kind of get our first break going from newsletter to video into audio, doing podcasting, which we were not totally certain of at that moment.
Talk us through that. What made you guys decide to start doing the podcast?
I'm going to throw this out there. It wasn't our idea.
Actually, full disclosure.
Yeah. We got selected for the Forbes 30 Under 30 list for just being like the side hustlers that we were through Market Snacks. And that was incredible publicity for us. And one person who noticed that recognition was a guy named Chris at a company called Cadence 13, which is a podcast production company. And Chris set up a meeting with Nick and me through a cold email. And he said, I love what you're doing with your daily email newsletter. Like, you clearly have a big user base that comes to you every single morning, every day, with their daily habit of figuring out financial news. There's a gap for that in the podcast space. Nobody is doing a digestible and fun and entertaining financial news podcast. Any chance you guys could translate what you're doing in a newsletter to a podcast? Yeah.
And to give everyone a taste, like the kind of stuff that Jack and I are covering every day is we want to make business news accessible, digestible, and on the stories you actually care about. We're getting into these stories about companies you're actually using and doing it in a fun way. And that was the big challenge. Jack and I have all this chemistry from being freshman year roommates. You see it in the newsletter. You saw it in video. How can we make this come out in a podcast?
So, Mike, Chris offered us a pilot season, 90 episodes. We were monetized through ads. We both wanted to get the audience as big as we could to generate as much ad revenue as possible. And our first episode was like May 23rd, 2018. That was the first episode of our 90 episode pilot. And Nick and I relocated back to New York City for that summer because we'd actually both moved away by that point. And we went up to the podcast studio on the Upper West Side every single day for a podcast. And things started to go really well.
I want you guys, we've gotten kind of the story of snacks. Before we get into kind of some more of like, how the sausage is made, I'd love to hear kind of what are you guys trying to do in the next couple months, year, et cetera.
Post-COVID, like we're thinking, in a world in which we can be getting back together, there is such a fun community of snackers. It's incredible, the people who listen to the podcast and how engaged this group is. And Jack and I love interacting with them on Twitter. But the reality is the best connections are the ones in person. And so, post-COVID, the idea of doing live events, the idea of Jack and I getting to get on stage and answer people's questions directly and interact with them there, to do live recordings of the podcast, to take this community, which we'll talk about later with some of the questions people have asked us, which is a key part of podcasting, the community, and add a real life element. I mean, long term, Jack and I have always said we want to be podcasting together forever. Like, we don't want to stop to this. So that's a great way we can kind of kick things up a notch.
What are some, recommendations you would make to aspiring podcasters about how to build that community and how to build that engagement?
When it comes to like actually building the community and getting engagement, that was something that Jack and I didn't learn immediately. It actually took us a little bit of time after we launched to realize, wait a second, podcasting is interesting in that it's a one-way relationship. It's Jack and then me interacting with you, and then you reach out to us through reviews or maybe you tweeted us. But then we realized there's actually a broader group here where individual listeners could be connecting with each other. So what we did to really prompt that is Jack and I started doing some strategic moves to drive engagement on the podcast. The first was actual like user submitted content. So Jack and I realized if you're listening, you also want to contribute to and be a part of what we're building. So we started having these snack facts at the end of the podcast, which was like a fun fact of the day kind of a thing. We did them in the newsletter, but here we had people tweet them to us. But then when we see it and then repeat that podcast and their name and their hometown at the end of our podcast, one, as a listener, it's fun to hear that at the end of the podcast. It's like a dessert or a treat at the end. But two, like if you're that person, you are now part of this community. You are friends with Jack and I getting to like share this info. And then your friends hear that on the podcast and they text you and say, hey, I just heard your snack fact and our hometown got mentioned. I mean, that was a huge kind of first step. And Jack and I have added some more fun engagement tactics into the podcast strategically since then.
But another thing Nick and I did early on to engage our community was in kind of an unconstructed way, to be honest. We just bought up some swag. So we designed our own stickers, we designed our own t-shirts, and we spent, money out of our pocket to produce that first batch of swag. And with no strings attached whatsoever, our most loyal and like active users who would tweet at us regularly, we'd ask for their mailing address and just send them some stuff. And lo and behold, they always like post a picture of them receiving it and putting it on their computer, which is just a great community building thing.
For all of you podcasters out there, definitely something to think about is how can I make sure to not only engage my fans and make them feel like that they kind of have part ownership in this thing that we're creating too.
Absolutely. Right. I mean, one thing Jack and I have always said is like, what we think of this as is like, are we journalists? Like, no, we're not journalists telling financial news. We kind of think of ourselves more as artists. And this happens to be our craft and our medium is podcasting. And as part of that, part of our job is also to like study the craft of podcasting. And when we do and like look at, and you can do this as aspiring young podcasters, look at the top podcasts that are out there, you'll notice trends. And those trends and those consistencies are things you want to implement in your podcast. A key trend is exactly what you brought up, Mike, which is engagement and community. And that's across all the top podcasts. So if you're noticing a trend across top podcasts, it's probably something you want to implement in yours.
Walk us through kind of the creative process. Like, how does an episode of Snacks Daily get made every single day?
Well, one of the first things you need to do is decide what is your format going to be. And especially for a daily podcast, but even for a weekly podcast, it's important to know, like, how is your podcast going to go? Because your listeners, if they're going to tune into you regularly, they like that familiarity of understanding, okay, this is the intro. Okay, they're about to transition into their first story. I can expect 2 more stories. This is going to be about 15 minutes. There's something about that helps people plan their mornings. So Nick and I have landed on a formula that we love, and we've done it every day for the last 2 years now. 2 years for the podcast, like 10 years for the newsletter. But we open with an intro. We do 3 stories, 3 separate stories, and we close with an outro. So for the creative process, though, it actually starts like first thing in the morning because we happen to be involved in news. We populate this shared Google Doc that's called the podcast prep document. And Nick, how about you chat about it while I throw it up on my screen right now?
Great.
Yeah.
So we go through then our headline hammer, and we're about to, as soon as we're done recording, Mike, Jack and I are jumping into this headline hammer to decide on our stories for the day. But basically, we're adding in stories, and we're sourcing a wide range of potential stories so that then we can get together, look at all these links, and say, hey, Snacks Daily isn't just about telling you the 3 stories that you have to know. It's the 3 stories we want you to know. It's the story you need to know because it's the top of business news, but also a couple maybe curated stories you're not going to see anywhere else. And we want to find the right industry mix, and we want to find the right takeaways.
So each member of the Snacks team, and we have like 5 editorial people now. In fact, some of them you can see live Google Docking in here. Everyone kind of does their own research about these stories, and at a certain time every day, which is 9:30 Pacific, we have the headline hammer meeting. And everyone who wrote these quick pitches on the stories, for example, I wrote this Snapchat Zuck's TikTok story. I did enough research that I'll be able to pitch this to the team. And I really want us to cover this story tomorrow. And if we do, we will throw it in here. We'll throw it in here. And then we have 2 more stories. And this is kind of our template, which we build every podcast out around.
So after we basically decide on that wonderful mix of stories, Jack and I then jump into the research and spend a couple hours putting together notes, like around midday, around lunch Pacific time. And I'll put together some notes on one story. Jack will put them together on his. And then because everything we're producing is really kind of a joint combination of our brains, I'll go into Jack's and he'll go into what I wrote, and we kind of craft them even further. And then from those notes, it's kind of like, then we go and take a quick walk because you got to like refresh your mind a little bit. And maybe we listen to a couple other podcasts as like warm up. We do some voice exercises. And then we like set up our microphones and equipment. And then Jack and I kind of chat a bit before to kind of get ourselves kind of loose and warmed up, just about anything. Turn on our devices. And then from there, it's kind of like a Curb Your Enthusiasm lesson or Curb Your Enthusiasm episode where we have the notes. It's not scripted out, but we like have key things we want to hit. And then Jack and I will record literally each section of the podcast, the intro, and then the first story, and then the second story, and just kind of riff off the notes and each other.
Who are the podcasts that you use as like inspiration? Like who are the creators or podcast hosts that you guys kind of aspire to be like?
Well, way back from the start of Nick's and my relationship, we had a mutual love for The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. And we have a continued mutual love for The Daily Show with Trevor Noah. So we try to emulate that, where The Daily Show takes political news and makes it entertaining. We're trying to do the same with financial news. So I still have a heavy Daily Show with Trevor Noah diet.
Basically what we do is we try to listen to that kind of material before the podcast because we kind of get amped up. And actually, to be honest, Mike, not only are we like listening to podcasts like to kind of get our heads ready, but Jack and I are both college athletes. So when we were in college, Jack was playing football, I was playing lacrosse. And for potential future podcasters who are currently college athletes, the amount of similarities between playing a sport and podcasting, at least like a high energy daily podcast that Jack and I have, is insane. I mean, just there's so many analogies. Like we're literally doing a warm up beforehand. We're like studying everyone else is out there to like get a sense of what they're doing so that we can like pick up on skills. After the podcast, it's always weird hearing your own voice, but we listen to ourselves and we listen to the podcast the next day and take notes and tell each other like game tape what we can improve upon. I keep saying this phrase "in the meantime" lately. It's stupid. I shouldn't say it so many times. Jack and I have recognized it by listening, and we call it out. We literally are applying the same kind of daily habits we had when preparing for college sports, we do the same thing for our podcast.
But we do take a full half hour to just talk about other things and to just get in a relaxed mood, because the like psychological and mental state that you're in, and whether you're like feeling good or whether you're not feeling so good, that will translate into the podcast. It'll manifest itself.
Give us just a quick, what are the vocal warm-ups? I'm going to put you in the spot here. What are you guys doing before you actually record?
When it comes to breathing, this is very important for podcasters. And you want to be able to talk a lot without necessarily needing to pause and take a new breath. And when you get to the end of your breath and you're like rushing to finish your sentence because you're running out of air, people can tell. So one exercise I learned from this guy named
Paul Mikolenko of the Listen app. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Paul taught me that every morning it's great if you try to fully inhale and expand your belly, because that's where like the air should really be. Don't inhale with your chest, but inhale with your belly. Take a full, incredibly full inhale and then slowly exhale with making a little S sound for a full minute. And you're basically holding your breath for a minute there, Mike. But if you can exhale with for a full minute, that means you can actually speak for a full minute without taking a new breath. Many times during the course of a podcast, I will think to myself, this is a big line I need to nail right here. I'm going to really fill myself up with a ton of air so that I have like everything ready to give.
When you're performing the podcast, the key word is performing. And it almost doesn't matter what your energy level is, but like what Jack and I do when we're recording is very much like a physical activity. We often say like, don't be 100% of yourself, be 110% of yourself on a podcast, which was advice we got from Cadence. Don't inhibit yourself. Physically, we're standing up, we're moving around. If Jack says something hilarious, I am like on the floor laughing, and I have to like step away from the microphone or like hit the wall. And like, so that physical element is a really fun part of hosting that you never see when you're listening, but that's what is often happening behind the mics.
Mike, I also just want to mention, his name's Paul Mikolenko, and he has a podcast actually called Total Body Voice, Training for Podcasters. It's a really good place to start if people want to figure out how to control their voice and breath.
So I know you guys obviously have this down to a T now, but I think it'd be fun to hear a little bit about like the beginning and what you learned, like for actually producing the podcast. If you were to do it again, what do you wish you would have known when it comes to production?
Our first podcast, in fact, our first 90 pretty much, were in a studio, in a very professional, high-quality studio. But you really don't need a professional level podcast studio. Like, you really don't. I have recorded the podcast from the hull of a boat.
Literally, Jack's bachelor party this past year, we got on a red-eye flight from San Francisco to Miami like a year ago. We landed in Miami airport at 6 a.m. We had to get a podcast out for like the next day or something. So Jack and I grabbed some like standing desks from like a TGI Fridays or something in the airport. In the terminal, set up our remote microphones like this, threw in our AirPods, looked insane as people ran by to their gates, and we recorded the podcast in the airplane terminal at 6 a.m. in Miami. Here's the shot.
Oh,
for
yeah,
Jack.
look at that.
Nick,
We definitely
it was
look like we
sin-
got off a red eye. We're using Sennheiser made in Germany mics, by the way. So that's honestly what Jack and I would say, something that you don't realize that we wish we'd known before, where we always thought we had to be in the studio space. The reality is, both with the combination of editor and some good, simple equipment, you can literally pod from anywhere. Right now, we do not have a fancy podcast studio setup, and Jack doesn't have a fancy podcast studio setup. And yet our listeners can't. No one's telling the difference because we're able to deliver the same quality product.
What do you see are common mistakes that a lot of early podcasters make? Like, what kind of mistakes did you guys make, and what did you do to fix them early on?
A quick lesson we learned very early on, fortunately, this production company we're working with was able to kind of guide us on it, is if Jack and I didn't know any better, we would have kind of just done a podcast and maybe added in interviews and like brought in different people and hosts and stuff. And what we found is actually consistency is key with podcasts. Like people tune into a podcast because they're usually it's part of their routine. And if that product is changing every day, you don't totally know what you're going to get. And if the length is changing, then maybe it doesn't work with your workout that morning. And then it's annoying because you got to find another podcast. So consistency is the lesson we learned early on. So that's why Jack and I begin every podcast with, "This is Nick."
This is Jack.
And then we say, "Hey, this is our best podcast yet," every day because it's better than our previous one. And then we list our 3 stories. And then we hit our first, second, and third story. And we don't just, suddenly do an interview one day and then 3 stories and 5 stories the next day. Like, the format doesn't change because people who are multitasking, which are podcast listeners, they expect consistency, and that's what keeps you part of their daily routines.
Don't be afraid to say the same thing from podcast to podcast. So I love what Nick says. Now, what Jack and I found interesting about this S1 is, and if you hear that on multiple episodes, you might think to yourself, I need to say it a fresh way every time. It's no, that's actually a familiarity that a lot of our listeners have said they love, kind of catching snacksisms, which is just things that I say frequently or that Nick says frequently. It's a good, endearing thing. It's not repetitive.
Consistency is key. And I think the other takeaway from what Jack's saying too is almost unique and personality is the other kind of key. And for a host-driven medium like podcast, that's key. That's why Jack loves mentioning something personal, or, we'll say what we just did last weekend in passing. These kind of personal little details, you don't force them. They just come up naturally, but let them come out in the podcast, because along with consistency, those personal details are what people then connect with you further after they've added you to their routines.
Everyone wants to know, how can they grow? What are some strategies? I think if you guys could touch on not only what's worked for you, but what you've seen work for other podcasts to grow their following, I think that would be super exciting for everyone who's watching.
We see 4 general categories. The first is what just you have to do, which is friends and family. If you're starting a business, you get your friends and family on board. Same if you're starting a podcast. It's the lowest cost way to grow, but you need those initial followers, and you need to sense that initial traction and get that initial feedback. And you're going to ask your friends and family to email everyone they know with your podcast.
Right.
Maybe this one's obvious, but also to subscribe, rate, and review, because and follow on Spotify.
Totally.
Yeah, those CTAs at the end are critical. Having a call to action. Jack and I end every podcast with a call to action, either about growing our audience. For us, we came out with a fun catchphrase. We say HYHYSD. Have you had your snacks daily? And at the end of every episode, we say, hey, tell your friends, HYHYSD, have you had your snacks daily? So for us, that's the call to action to help other people grow it. But then there are kind of things you can do that are a little bit more technical, like cross-promoting with an audience or another podcast with a similar audience. So for that, podcasting isn't a huge industry. Look up a podcast you think is complementary, where you think their audience would like yours. Reach out to organically, just email the host, or if you work with a production company, have them reach out. But if you don't, just organically reach out and say, hey, maybe we could do a content swap. Maybe we could each give each other a CTA at the end of the podcast. And I'll say my listeners should check out yours and yours should check out mine. So that's kind of a next step you can do.
I think personally that it is the still most tried and true way to build audience is to go onto other podcasts and have those same people on your podcasts.
And at the end of the day, you nail those 3, Mike. You could always do paid advertising. That's kind of the last option. It's the most expensive. It does convert from what we've studied. And, it's the most technical and the most expensive out of them, but it also does work too.
One of the questions that we got was, how do you embrace who you are, how you sound and what you do? How do you guys really make sure that authenticity comes through in the pod?
Kind of have to channel this funny energy in that there are all these people listening to you. It's like you're speaking to this huge audience or a stadium potentially. So what you kind of have to do is kind of just realize that just be yourself, and that podcasting is a host-driven medium. It's about the connection with the host. This isn't a cocktail party. It's a fun chat with friends like you're walking out of a bar. That's what podcasting is.
If you record a story, you can re-record that story if you didn't like how it went. You could feel embarrassed by that and want to get a perfect take, but that's going to be at the expense of authenticity. So the first take you do is the most authentic one. It's where you're going to get the most genuine reactions from what the co-host says, and it's the one where you're going to get the most authentic response. So Nick and I like to have a bias for first takes. And if we finish a story and we say, I kind of screwed up that sentence, Nick, let's do it anyway. People screw up,
Yeah.
you know?
A nice benefit is podcasting is supposed to be more raw. It is not cable TV. It is not like you have to have crazy intro music and then exit music and like it's like the Emmy Awards. So that's okay. In fact, that's preferred. It almost is awkward sometimes when podcasts are overproduced because it feels
Yeah, I
like they're
agree.
compensating for something in the content. This is what the podcast is. It's the mic and a couple people. Or one person.
Totally.
And don't overthink it.
You guys obviously are co-hosts. You guys have been friends forever. If you guys had to say what makes the other person a good co-host, what would you say?
I would say Nick's unbelievable ability to improvise and his just natural humor. I've always said that humor was invented in New York City. And Nick brings that kind of like city humor that I lacked in my rural upbringing in Vermont.
Jack and I like to talk about this co-hosting partnership as a Venn diagram. And, we each are bringing something different to the table. Jack's diligence and like his care for like the details on stories is the critical element that makes what we do have so much validity and so exciting to tell so that people have fun with the news, but also trust what we're telling. And that's an incredibly fun part that Jack brings to this partnership. But then the Venn diagram part where we're like overlapping, that's where like the fun comes from and where the specialness of the relationship with your co-host comes from. And it's serious things like, for example, we both trust each other immensely. Like if Jack's saying something, I just trust it. I don't need to second guess it. So that trust element is something we share. But then there are the other things like a similar sense of a shared sense of humor and like what's actually funny. And like, you want to have just the right amount of overlap, but not necessarily be the identical people.
Let me also say, if you're going to launch a daily podcast with someone, that someone has to be someone you trust. It's a major endeavor, the daily podcast. I really like the Venn diagram example you gave me. There's a lot of overlap, but enough uniqueness on the edge there for it to be interesting.
Totally. You guys started out as Market Snacks, and then you had this, incredible thing happen to you. You got acquired by Robinhood, became Snacks Daily. Since the majority of people watching this and the participants in Next Wave are going to be more in that Market Snacks phase, I'm curious to hear, what were the big differences or similarities you guys found between how you approached Market Snacks and maybe how that changed or stayed the same when you guys became Snacks Daily?
Something that's just cool about entrepreneurship is that I actually think most of the things haven't changed. At the end of the day, 99% of what we're doing is the exact same. We're fortunate to have editorial independence, so we cover stories in the same way like we always have. Our routine, our daily routine is the same. Now, now we're just at a different phase where we aren't doing as many maybe hustle elements, but we're still working just as hard and going through the same routine. So in a funny way, it's almost a good sign if you can maintain that excitement and that hustle from day one of your startup through post-acquisition of your entrepreneurial venture, if it's in the audio space. It almost might be the goal.
The hustle was definitely fun. We don't do ads anymore, which is a big difference between today and our Market Snacks days. But we also learned in a scrappy way how to do a lot of different things. So we've learned how to make attractive social media posts using scrappy graphic design tools that are free online. And if you have a buddy who can teach you that, learn that, because that's going to be a great skill to help you bootstrap your one-person operation or two-person operation to seem like it's more than just a one or two-person operation.
We touched on this a bit, but I think there were some questions around, how can a young podcaster who is probably, learning as they go, hitting a bunch of roadblocks and challenges as they try to get this started, how would you encourage them to, keep going and push through some of those initial challenges they might face?
I would encourage people to, I'm not going to encourage people not to look at the reviews that get posted of your podcast, because it's human nature. You're gonna. And if you don't, good for you. You must be meditating or something. But when you read your reviews, realize there's going to be people who like to just be negative. And there's going to be haters out there. And Nick and I get 0-star posts sometimes. And we try to ignore those because we're not trying to feed everyone. If people outside of your niche don't like your product, that's fine. So look at the people who are leaving you good reviews, and those are the ones where you need to be like, let's do more of that.
Right.
Whatever it is that a person said that raved about you, focus on that and do that. And the alternate would be to try to not do the things that your haters say, but like don't worry about them because they're not your audience. Yeah. They're not going to come back to you. Just focus on your core, on your base.
Don't worry about the trolls.
Yeah.
Seriously.
Just ignore them.
It's real. Yeah.
Just ignore them. It's all about the 90% that are absolutely loving the product. And that's why, if you're ever down on your luck or going through like a hard week or like you put out a couple of podcasts and like you're exhausted, this is why it's important to have a social media handle with your podcast and check the reviews and like understand that you're doing this for the community. You're doing this for the listeners. Right. You don't see them on the mic right now. You don't see them in the recording device, but they're out there. And it's just because the nature of the medium, it's hard for them to connect with you directly. But like go and check them. One thing Jack and I do when you have a co-host is we celebrate the wins. Every few weeks we'll either set aside time or when we're together, we're fortunate to have a socially distanced beer together after our quarantine. Celebrate when you've hit milestones. Maybe your milestone is a certain number of downloads, or maybe it's having a certain number of episodes, or maybe it's a certain interview you nail. Have a milestone, celebrate it accordingly, because that's critical so that it doesn't only feel like hustle.
The last thing I'll add is just recognize that there's a lot of benefits to you personally from launching a podcast. And if you never reach commercial success, first of all, most podcasts don't.
Right, yeah.
But if you launch a podcast and show consistency for 2 months, and decide to shut that project down because you didn't see enough traction to continue, that is a success. And that is a project that you'll be able to tell in a job interview, and it's going to jump off your resume. That you launched this podcast, it had this funny name, you had 60 episodes.
Yeah.
Wow. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, I think that it's important to remember that whether you succeed or whether you fail, everything is experience. So I think that's a smart way to think about it for people who are struggling, that every struggle is just a learning, and every time they overcome an obstacle is just bettering themselves, whether that be in podcasting or in life, which is kind of deep. And
there it is.
A perfect way for us to wrap this up. Yeah. Well, thank you guys for taking the time. This is a wrap on our Next Wave Masterclass. Thank you guys for joining. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. Any final words or anything you want to leave all these aspiring podcasters with?
Yeah. When Nick and I launched Market Snacks, I don't think, selling the company to Robinhood was the plans, Nick. The plans was
I'm checking
to do
the
something
business
fun.
It wasn't, yeah.
The plan was to do something fun, to do something different, and to fill a void that we did see that could have some potential for commercial success.
And have
But it's back to the point of an entrepreneurial endeavor. And if you launch a podcast, you are being an entrepreneur. There are so many benefits to others who consume your product and to yourself, and commercial success is really just one of them. I just want to double down on that point.
If Jack and I had just focused on revenues to start, it would have been a short-lived success because it took us a couple years to get that first revenue. This has been about so much more than that. It really comes down to how much we just enjoy getting to do this every day. And that's the most important thing. So don't let these other distractions get in the way that we mentioned before. Just go and launch this thing and get the mics on.
It's about having fun. Yeah. That's the bottom line. And like we said earlier, if you're having fun, your audience is going to have fun, and you're more likely to be successful.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you guys again for joining. I'll let you guys get back to the rest of your very busy day. And I can't wait to listen to tomorrow's Snacks Daily.
Yeah, we're going to hit the headline hammer right now, Mike, and it'll be better than yesterday's Snacks Daily.
Exactly. It's going to be, what would you say it's going to be?
The best one yet.
The
Yeah, it's
best
gonna
one
be the
yet,
best
right? Yeah. Okay. Thank you guys. I'll talk to you guys soon.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Mike.
So that's a wrap on our masterclass with Nick and Jack from Snacks Daily. I want to thank them for participating. I also want to thank all of you for participating in our first ever Spotify Next Wave initiative. I hope all of you have learned some tips and tricks, and hopefully you can all take your podcast to the next level so that next time we do this, I'm interviewing one of you guys. So until next time, I'm Mike Muni and hope to talk to all you guys soon.